Right, hello everyone. Welcome to our final segment in Visionology. And I guess as a quick recap, what we've been talking about over the number of weeks has been a sort of an intro, warming you up to what we've been talking about over the last little while. And then one of the sessions dealt with where we are right now, trying to use this time of COVID-19 as a point of pause so that we can reflect on where we are right now. And then the next session, we spent a lot more time discussing what our vision is, where we'd like to be, how we'd like to see our life going forward, and appealing to what our values are and reflecting on that. And so I guess today what we're going to be talking about is some ideas on strategies that you might want to utilize to get from point A, where you are, to point B, where you're wanting to be. And I guess that can be in various ways. It can be in emotional ways. It can be in terms of behavioral ways, in terms of work opportunities, in terms of relationship building. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm going to hand over to our lovely group of psychologists that we've been speaking with, and we've been developing our relationships over this period of time as well, which has been just so exciting project together. So let's talk about that very thing. How can we think of some strategies that would be of use to people in the situation?
Thanks, Mark. I think that's a great summary of what we've been discussing so far. And I think a great place to start in trying to get quite practical in how to cope and navigate through these times is something that Stephen Covey came up with, which is around the circle of concern versus a circle of influence or control. And I found since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been talking to myself and my clients a lot about that concept around, let's try focus on the things that we can control. And it's not that the things that we can't control don't worry us, don't concern us, don't impact us, but our bandwidth is so limited in general, but especially during this pandemic. And so to be very discerning about where do we put our energy and using that energy on something that is within our control. So, things that possibly are not worth, that we actually can't control is whether other people are wearing masks, whether other people are social distancing. We definitely can't control how long this thing is going to last and what that looks like. And so it's really about having more of an inward approach and saying, well, I can wear a mask and I can socially distance. And if there's a restaurant or a place that's not doing that, I can avoid that. And I can try and influence the behavior by having conversations. But to worry and get angry and irritable about what other people are or aren't doing is almost kind of a misuse or misallocation of our very limited energy.
I love that idea, Lauren. And I think for me, a word that just came to my mind when you spoke about there is just prioritizing. What do I need to prioritize right now? What can wait for later? And what is completely irrelevant? And I recently done a series on burnout. And for me, that was exactly it. It was stopping and pausing and reflecting, first of all. Where do I need that help? And then doing things simply like self-care, taking some time out to look after yourself, to give yourself a pause, to choose where you want to influence yourself. I think what you've said just sums up all of what I was thinking as well. And I think it's such a practical, basic step that everybody can do.
I think throughout the series this far, we've spoken about things like self-awareness. We've basically placed that focus back on ourselves, back on how we engaging with ourselves. How do we reevaluate what that vision is we're working towards? So it's pointing towards a sense of self-involvement here. And last time we also said that self-curiosity almost needs to be paired with self-compassion. So if we are going to start thinking about things that we need to prioritize in our life, things that are within our control. I'm also wondering, what is our approach to it? What language do we use when we talk to ourselves about the changes that we need to make to help navigate us towards that idea of a vision that we have in life? And it's at that point where we start becoming aware of some perhaps unhealthy habits that we've cultivated, not just during this time, but for a long time already. A good example of unhealthy habits is not just on a behavioral level, but on a thought level. What are the ways in which we engage with ourselves that ends up making us feel a little bit more stuck? For example, how do we label ourselves if we make a mistake? Are there certain words that we use? You drop something, tell yourself, oh, you're such an idiot. That might seem like a minor thing, but what language do we use to speak to ourselves, and what does it reflect of thought processes? One of the challenges that we need to overcome is this idea that our thoughts are only automatic. Okay, on an average day, we have thousands of thoughts that we're not aware of. And we can say that they are automatic and that we can't necessarily change the underlying structures and the underlying unhealthy habits that manifest in those thought processes. But that is a misperception that we need to challenge. Okay, I think if we're going to start talking about self-awareness, then we need to first start by just observing how we process our responses to situations in our thoughts. What type of patterns do I engage in making sense of situations, making sense of how I'm able to cope in certain situations, trying to become aware of what those possible obstacles are that I've been experiencing in my life, maybe for some time already, that have limited me. For example, labeling myself or labeling other people. For example, thinking in terms of black and white, all or nothing thinking, all in or all out. It either has to be 100% or it's not worth the try whatsoever. Overgeneralizing certain experiences we might have, telling ourselves that this is part of a larger pattern without necessarily seeing the subtle nuances in different situations that might affect its outcomes. In the field of psychology, this approach falls within what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. And you can do a quick Google search to see a whole list of unhealthy thought patterns or unbalanced ways of thinking or twisted forms of thinking that can give you a little bit more structure in terms of what are those specific unhealthy thought patterns that we need to become aware of.
I think one thought pattern, just to add to those that you've listed, Dave, is the catastrophizing. And I think that one, I think we've all fallen prey to during this time. And I think the media and social media definitely doesn't help. And so I suppose that's what popped to mind as I was listening to you around how can we be a little bit, we need to have self-awareness and kind of be aware of, are we over dramatizing a situation? Are we catastrophizing because a pandemic is a catastrophe and what is going on in general is quite catastrophic? So the tendency to go that way is much easier. And so it's almost like we need to be a little bit more disciplined in our thinking to say, is it really as bad as that? Or yes, maybe it's bad as that out there, but what's my current experience? And kind of trying to separate the catastrophe and the drama that is real out there, so like the fact, with what your current experience is. Yeah, I love that piece, because that's where I think the self-compassion also has to come in, because even if it is quite catastrophic for you, it's how can you gently treat yourself? How can you, I know it sounds so cliched, but be kind to yourself as you navigate whatever it is that is challenging. And years ago, I had a colleague of mine because I was speaking to myself, like you mentioned. I said, I dropped something, or I made a mistake, and I said, oh, I'm such an idiot. And she turned around and she said, please don't speak about my good friend Lauren like that. And it was such an eye-opener for me, because I was like, I would never speak to a friend like that. But I speak to myself like that. And so it's almost that self-compassion piece is, you know, would you, if this was a friend, would you speak to them the same way you speak to yourself in that internal dialogue?
You know, I think one of the strategies that we need to consider if we want to change unhealthy thought patterns, for example, the catastrophizing, is to look at what the evidence is telling us, especially when we become aware of being affected by a situation. How do we consider the evidence for it and the evidence against it? And it's not just in terms of our response to the current situation, the COVID pandemic. We can backtrack a little bit and ask ourselves, generally speaking, how have I been responding to challenges in life? Have I really given myself that opportunity to just pause and consider the facts? And it becomes more and more difficult, especially when we start to look at relationships, for example. I mean, the facts are very often subjective, and the facts are very often, metaphorical. It's not something concrete. But what are those facts that we can be on the lookout for that supports my interpretation of a situation? In other words, if I'm experiencing a crisis in the relationship, is there evidence that this is really a crisis, or is there perhaps evidence that this is just a stumbling block?
Dave, what you and Lauren have just mentioned, it brings to my mind also with CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, the relationship between our thoughts and our feelings. So if we've had experiences or where we are catastrophizing, for example, that is going to ultimately lead to more negative experiences, negative feelings as well. So it's really about us adjusting how we see something, because that will ultimately influence our feelings, or vice versa. How we feel about something is going to make us think more negatively. And I think another technique that is really useful, which also it kind of links into what you've just said, is the idea of looking at past successes with solution-focused therapy. And, you know, in the past you've coped, in the past this is what you've done. So if you did it in the past, you can do it again now. If you coped with a stressful situation in the past, that was, I mean, yes, COVID-19 is unprecedented, but if you coped in the past with somebody being sick, or with you having a reduced salary, or whatever the case may be, you've coped previously, you can do it again. So it's looking at those past successes to really encourage you to move forward now, and to use some of those skills that you maybe looked at or used previously, to use those skills again now.
So just to let the viewers know a little bit, we're using some terms like solution-focused therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and I think it's important to realize that from a psychological perspective, there are different models of intervention, and different models conceptualize or think about and understand people and situations in slightly different ways. And that conceptualization helps guide what we recommend and the treatment strategy that we use. And so at the moment, we're talking more about the cognitive behavioral solution focused, and we're talking more about the cognitive element, the thoughts and how they've been affected. And Dave also mentioned the word, if you've been affected by something. And I think this is important. I always make the distinction that if you've been informed by something, it doesn't really touch you too much. But if you've been affected by something, then you actually need to pause and think about it, because it's going to leave its mark if you are carrying along with you certain interpretations or a certain perspective that is potentially erroneous or potentially irrational. I like to think of it as a little court case. You know, we've got to go and we've got to ask, what is the evidence? So you've got to write that down. Again, I'm repeating the fact that writing things down is important, because it gets it out of your head. When you put it on paper, you engage more of the left hemisphere of your brain, the more rational center, the logical center. And so it starts to pave the way for you to be able to look at what's the evidence for this. And often there is some element of truth in what you're thinking. But sometimes, and most of the times, if it's affecting us badly, it's an overextension. And we need to then do the work of looking carefully at what is the evidence against that. And again, this is where having someone external to ourselves is so important, whether that be your counselor, whether it be your therapist, whether it be your spouse, that can reflect back to you. Like Lauren said, don't speak to my friend like that. That's such a pertinent point, is we need someone to catch us in our blind spots when we are saying those things that are seemingly automatic, but they affect us in the long term. So get that extra person, that feedback source, so that we can then start to take stock and challenge that thought in various ways.
Mark, sometimes the evidence that we are being affected by a situation is very forthcoming. It's very obvious. Let's say, for example, at home you have a water pipe burst. I mean, the water is all over the place. There's no doubt that something happened. Okay, so you shut down the water mains and you call the plumber and they try and figure out the fix for it. I think when it comes to our personal lives, very often that's where we stop. We become aware of the evidence, we try the fix, but that's it. At some stage you need to switch the water mains on again. And that's where we are required to take the next step. Once you become aware of how this has changed my life, and not just COVID, but like I said previously as well, challenges pre-COVID as well. Once you become aware of how you've been affected by a situation, and you try and apply some fix, that's all good and well. But then you need to move on to the next stage, which we can say is an experimental stage, because you kind of opening the water mains, hoping that the fix works. But you need to challenge yourself to put yourself out there again. If it is a crisis in a relationship that you are trying to fix, you cannot get stuck in that space where the water mains are switched off. You need to tell yourself that despite me feeling apprehensive, despite me being uncertain whether the fixes work, I need to allow myself to take that next step towards immersing myself in the relationship again.
From a behavioral perspective, I think that what Dave is saying, and I think we need to all do, is we need to realize that behaviors need to change. We need to actually risk and put ourselves out there and not allow avoidance to continue, because avoidance is a very strong factor that maintains anxiety. And at the moment, there is so much anxiety on the go. So how can we actually behaviorally get people to move out of an anxious lockdown situation where they're feeling stuck, where they're feeling like, life is moving on, we're re-engaging with society, but I'm still feeling really stuck and trapped by fear?
Mark, I think behaviorally, a good strategy is, we keep saying stop. And so I've thought of an acronym that can go with stop. So when we are, especially in the moment, feeling incredibly overwhelmed and anxious, instead of like pushing through whatever it is you're trying to do, it is to just stop. But what does stop stand for? So the S is obviously to stop. The T is to take 3 deep breaths, or 4 or 5, but some really just move away from whatever you're doing or whoever it is that's triggered you, and just take deep breaths. The O is to just observe. So take a moment to observe. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What was triggered? Am I believing any of those thought distortions? Have I made up any kind of stories about the situation? So can I separate fact from story? And then the P is to proceed with a very small, practical action that can just get you out of that anxious state. And then obviously it's an action that is within your control. So it's not about proceed, like if your internet goes down, it's not about proceeding with trying to throw the internet out the window, because that's not really going to help and it's not within your control. But what could you do next? And so using that stop on a regular basis, I think is quite a powerful way when we're feeling in the moment quite overwhelmed.
Mark, I think in one of our previous discussions, you said that you should look at yourself in the mirror and say, just do it, just do it, just do it, and repeat that 30 times. And ultimately, that proceed in stop, that is what it boils down to for me. We can have long and hard conversations with ourselves about how we need to show ourselves more compassion. We can have long and hard conversations with ourselves about how meaningful this lockdown has been in terms of just simplifying things for ourselves. But it's up until that point where you start acting on it that it's really just that, a conversation. And I think maybe there's sometimes this misperception of therapy as well, that we're just going to sit and talk about things. What does that help? And that's a good question, because that helps very little unless we are actually working towards implementing changes, acting on those values that you feel you have been crystallizing as part of your vision. If you are identifying what those values are that you're working towards, then how do I start acting on it right now? What are the changes that I need to implement in my relationships, in my work life, in my family life? Are there phone calls I need to make and specific conversations I need to have to inform the people in my life about those changes that I want to make myself accountable for?
Yeah, Dave, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, sometimes when you see people that are too stuck in their head, we actually need to encourage action. And action is really, really important. Funny enough, some people that just act without thinking, you need to stop the action and get them to really start thinking more and reflecting on their thoughts. So I think for the viewers, they all need to figure out for themselves which is the area that they need to be working on. And working on from a behavioral perspective is really encouraged. And I think as part of a comprehensive treatment package, if anyone really went to go and see a doctor or a psychologist, they should be thinking along the lines of a biopsychosocial intervention. The bio stands for biological. So what biologically do you need to be doing as a form of strategy to get yourself moving from here to there? And one of the questions is medication, and maybe we need to talk about that just now. Alongside those biological things is exercise, which we've already raised. It's sleep, like we've raised in a previous session. Taking cognizance of those things, because those either facilitate or limit us moving forward. Our diet, working with people with eating disorders, there are a lot of things there behaviorally that need to change, but there's a lot of resistance emotionally, because often the solution is part of the problem, or the problem is part of their own solution. And so that's an interesting dynamic. But from a biological perspective, there are lots that we can do there. From a psychological perspective, I think we've spoken about a number of things today and in previous sessions. And also from a social perspective, is it you need to work on your relationship with your spouse, relationship with your parents, relationship with your work colleagues. And so it's a lot of that takes action. So you can't just sit here doing nothing. There is a push for us to move and proceed, as Lauren said, proceed meaningfully, so that you can start to create the very future that you're hoping for and working towards.
I think, Mark, what comes to mind listening to what you've just said is, I can't remember the whole quote, but it says something like, life is created either by default or design, and either way is your choice and responsibility. And I suppose what you're saying is, COVID has given us an opportunity to stop and to think things through, and maybe stop the default way of living, and it's kind of making that decision to live by design. And it's harder sometimes to take responsibility, to be aware of our thoughts and our actions and the impact we're having on others. So to live a more conscious, deliberate, intentional life is sometimes harder, but it does move us out of being victim and help us to own our own story and own the end of our own story. And I think, something that has struck me right from the beginning of the pandemic is how everybody's trying to own the end of the story. We've got every futurist, economist, medical professional telling us what the graph is going to look like, what the economy is going to look like, every letter of the alphabet, as we've said before. And I think really, thinking about this narrative and the way that we speak to ourselves, it's how do we own our own story? And we operate from this inside out approach, and not handing the power over to whoever it may be, the government, the doctors, our bosses at work, and deciding how we want our story to unfold. So doing it by design, I think, is quite important.
There's a very powerful phrase that comes from a Gestalt psychology model, and that phrase is, "And I take responsibility for that." Gestalt therapy is quite harsh sometimes, quite confrontative, but if a client is sitting in front of you, or a friend is sitting in front of you and saying, "I'm fed up of this, I'm fed up of that," the response being, say that again and follow it with the phrase, "And I take responsibility for that." It's quite a jarring phrase, but I think it invites us to ask ourselves, what can we control? What do we need to do? How can we shift out of that victim mode? How can we move forward positively, as Lauren is suggesting? So for each of us, whenever we're feeling stuck, whenever we're feeling blamed, whenever we're feeling overwrought with emotion, we need to start to say to ourselves, "I take responsibility for that." But then that sets us up for the next question, is where to from here? What is my strategy? What is my plan going forward?
Mark, you spoke earlier about the biopsychosocial approach, and I'm glad that you're mentioning it, because I think sometimes we think that the answers to emotional questions, the answers to personal questions about life and about the sense of meaning and about moving through difficult circumstances are deeply philosophical. But we have to remind ourselves that the most basic building blocks of good health, mental health as well, is our physical health. You were talking about diet, you were talking about sleeping. We can say the same for exercise. And we kind of, I'm sure there might be some viewers that are thinking that, I didn't really sign in for this discussion because I wanted to talk about my physical health. But those are the fundamental building blocks of how we treat ourselves, how we take responsibility for life. And sleeping, for example, there are crucial metabolic processes that occur during sleeping that enables us, that sets us up for the possibility of having a good day or having a bad day. So if you become aware of the fact that you're having sleeping difficulties, what steps are you taking to try and resolve it? And with taking steps, I do not necessarily mean that the first line of treatment is medication. In some cases, medication is very helpful. But there are steps that you can take yourself to work on your own sleep hygiene, to work on certain routines that help you just get a good night's rest. And sometimes it's as basic as owning and taking responsibility for those biological elements that are very much part of our day-to-day life.
When medication is indicated, often a lot of people have very negative views of medication, and that's a barrier that needs to be overcome. And I think that a lot of people have the stereotype that they're going to become addicted to medication, they're going to be placed on medication, and it's going to be they're going to be on it for the rest of their lives. It's going to make them like a zombie. And while we all know those horror stories, and people have sometimes had older siblings or older relatives who have maybe had those unfortunate experiences, there is a lot of value when medication is appropriately used. And so one needs to try and unpack some of those negative associations in order to facilitate a person actually getting the help that they need. Because sometimes the thoughts about their current circumstances cannot be addressed very well from a cognitive behavioral perspective until they start to get their neurochemicals working better. And so sometimes it's best to pause psychotherapy in order to actually get the medication right so that the neurochemicals are right.
Yeah, I would agree, Mark. I think about psychiatric or mental health medication in the same way as I would about high cholesterol medication or heart disease medication or insulin for diabetes. So if there is something that is kind of out of sync in your neurochemicals, then let's get the medical help for it. So we don't think twice if somebody is diagnosed with diabetes type 2 and they say, oh, well, I must take the insulin, that's going to help me. And so I think it's really about moving beyond the stigma around what medication can do for us and how it provides a crucial role. And I think the word you mentioned is so important: when appropriately prescribed. So just like you would go to a specialist for any medical ailments, I would really recommend going to a specialist, in other words, a psychiatrist, who can do a proper diagnosis. So I think often where the kind of negative experiences happen is when people just pop into their GP, and I've got nothing wrong with GPs. I think many are very experienced, but they're not a specialist in mental health and psychiatric issues. So it's about getting a specialist assessment who can then put you on the right kind of medication, and I guess then the other thing is tracking it. So it's not about starting it for 2-3 weeks, saying nothing happens, nothing's helped, and then going off it again. So it's kind of committing to it and giving it time to have an impact. So it's treating it like you would with any other physical. You wouldn't start a course of antibiotics and just stop it because you hadn't felt anything. So I just think the way we engage with psychiatric medication needs to have the same thought process and the same awareness and the same cautiousness as we would with medications for physical ailments.
I'm just thinking about various clients that I've had that are already struggling to move from lockdown into society again. And so a treatment plan would look like getting them to talk about what their fears are, and then trying to look at the evidence for and against those, but then setting up like a graded hierarchy of situations that are starting with least anxiety provoking to more anxiety provoking, maybe even looking at it on a scale of 0 to 10, and then slowly getting them to picture in their minds moving up that ladder by then employing the various relaxation strategies that we could teach and coach them on. And then getting them to behave, to move, to take action, and actually in reality go out and face those situations slowly but surely, and then trying to extinguish that overwhelming anxiety response. And now what we see is when there are impediments to moving on, and often people will say, no, I don't want to be on any anxiety medication or any antidepressant. If they can start carrying on and progressing up that hierarchy, okay, and they're facing it and they're maintaining the gains, then they're doing it behaviorally and cognitively. That's great. But if they are plateauing and are just getting worse, that's an indicator of saying, look, we need to get some support of the medication. You know, the medication needs to really just allow you to then get into a place where you're willing and ready to take the risks and the challenges and actually face it. Because good therapy, it takes work. It's not that easy. We've got to face our fears. We've got to face our fear and do it anyway. But there are real circumstances when that fear is just so overwhelming that then we need to get the support of a medication.
I think people need to be mindful that we cannot do this. We cannot be in lockdown and then go to the shopping mall where there's thousands of people. You know, we need to take steps slowly. So whether it involves you having someone come to your, you know, a friend come to your garden or come to your gate of your house and you have a conversation with them through the gates. Then slowly you have someone coming outside your property or your main door to have a conversation. Then you invite someone into your house. So don't just invite 5,000 people into your house straight away, because you're going to have a panic attack most likely. You know, you're going to be extremely anxious. If you need to go to the shops, plan what time you need to go to the shops. Go when it's likely to be less busy, so that your first experience is not chaotic and not dreadful. And basically, like you say, Mark, you're building up slowly for those small successes. But I think something else we also need to be aware of is, if we are wanting to move from a point of where we are to where we plan to be or where we want to be, we need to be willing to listen to others. So when others are saying to us, you are so negative at the moment, or like Lauren, you said, I would not speak to my friend like that. We've got to be open to receiving that feedback from others, because as much as we can have self-awareness, those that are around us also have an awareness of us and of the other, which in that case represents us. And sometimes we may not be aware of how negative we're being, or how anxious we are, or how depressed we are. So when your partner starts saying to you, well, listen, I think you need to go see a doctor, you're not eating, you haven't got out of bed, you have lost an excessive amount of weight, you know, you've got to be open to the fact that they're saying that for a reason. Number one, they care. And maybe they're saying that for a reason as well, in the sense that there's a problem. So it's about us just being open to hearing what those, maybe I would say those that we care about, or those loved ones around us, or the people we trust, what they say about us.
I wish we had more time to discuss this. I mean, I think you can all see that we can all get quite excited about what we're talking about. And as psychologists, I mean, we can go on for hours and hours. But I think maybe we should try and tie the conversation together. You know, up until this point, we've spoken about becoming aware of perhaps certain changes we need to consider making in terms of unhealthy thought patterns, changes we need to consider making in terms of our behaviors. So becoming aware of things that need to change. But I'm wondering if that would necessarily lead to us becoming aware of our successes. Is there any measures that we need to consider putting in place to make ourselves aware of the gains that we've made? You know, remember, we're working towards a certain ideal. We were working towards our ideal self or a vision. How do we keep track of our progress?
I love that question, Dave, and I often work with my clients on what I call a mastery list. And can you kind of every week or every couple of weeks sit down and just say, what do I feel I've mastered this week? What can I be proud of? What is something that worked? So maybe mastered is too strong a word, but something that I've done well, something that worked, something that I enjoyed, something that energized me. So that you start generating kind of a list of those other realities when things feel incredibly tough. So in those moments when you're really feeling overwhelmed and stressed and everything feels, when catastrophizing takes over, you can bring out this mastery list and say, oh wow, okay, it's not all so bad. Remember, I actually did this, or that was something I enjoyed, or that's something that worked. So I think it's a great idea. Again, it's that writing thing, Mark. It's kind of having an ongoing list of things that go well. some people have a jar where they write these things down and pop them in a jar, and then they can just pull one out whenever they're feeling overly negative or down. So some way of recording it, I think, is important.
Dave, I love that question. And I think something we also need to be aware of is that, you know, maybe the fact that we got out of bed this morning was a step of positivity or a step of accomplishment. You know, the fact that we made a great business decision doesn't necessarily only have to be the success that we celebrate. It's getting out of bed every morning. It's getting changed. It's being able to face the day. So we almost need to be a little bit more gentle in terms of where we see those successes. Those successes, we need to celebrate the small successes, because those big ones right now are actually just too much. So celebrate the small ones. And as we do that, we start growing into those bigger ones. And I think another thing that it kind of relates to what we've spoken about overall today, but, you know, you wouldn't say that to your friend, like Lauren said. So what would your friend cheer you on with? What would your friend say, wow, well done in? You know, so it's really about having those conversations with yourself, but as if you were talking to a friend of yours, because you would never dream of being so critical of a friend. So why are you being so critical of yourself?
We've looked at some really practical strategies and ways of taking care of ourselves and moving forward. And I think the one piece that is really important that we can't stress enough is that you can't do this alone. And so if you're using your support network, that's great. And if that's working for you, and even if you are using your support network and you still feel you need help, I think it's really important to reach out for help. Whether it's a counselor, a psychologist, there's, you know, the South African Depression and Anxiety Group has been amazing during this time. There's Lifeline, there's a huge number of mental health resources, and I think it's about, I guess one of the main things we've wanted to do over this series is really debunk the stigma around mental health, and that there's nothing wrong with you if you're struggling. It's this thing of like, it's okay not to be okay, and reaching out for help is a really important step. And if you're not sure where to go for help, then contact one of us, email us, Facebook us, and we can really try and help you connect with resources in your area.